As a prelude to our film, A Walk Round the Bonk, we have great pleasure in introducing a cine film taken by a local man, Donald Perks, that gives us a real insight in how Cheslyn was in 1965.
Let's start at top end. There's no rush. At Wotton's farm and Holly Bush, there's been no change, it would appear, as all goes on from year to year. So let's pass on to Cemetery Street and try to find the print of feet of Harry, Bill and Uncle Jack, brought here in state by horses black. They came in search of better things, to hear the sound of angels' wings. But stay, let's not dwell on our sorrow, 'cause there's always a tomorrow. There's Campion's Wood, a beauty spot. If sold to builders, it's had its lot. They want to build a new estate. Please God, preserve it from this fate, and make the local planners see they must leave this for posterity. Allotments where they say things grow, if work is done with spade and hoe, and there's no such thing as luck, just loads and loads of good strong muck. Now look, there is a wooden seat for folks that live and pass Hill Street. So while we're here, we'll climb the hill. We'll take more care than Jack and Jill. And so we find the village school. Oh, happy days, no swimming pool. From 9 to 12 and 1 till 4, we learned our tables, what a bore. But what's this here? Oh gosh, oh hell, some low-down bounders pinch the bell. And what about the tall slim steeple? Heavenly Father, who are these people? Remember all the fun we had, some got sore backsides, very sad. Simpkin, Carter, Stokes and Bale all gave their share of aching tail. But as the 3 R's were our goal, there is no rancour in our soul. Now let us to the High Street travel and find more mysteries to unravel. Hell's Corner, now an open space, used once to be a meeting place. Red Ikey's farm with barn and cows, some council tenants now doth house. The Nelson Inn and Red Lion too have disappeared into the blue. And now we come to Townwell Bank. We've kept the pump. Whom do we thank for this one piece of history? It is indeed a mystery. And on to Salem, United, Meth, where we'll be members until death. The doors stay closed throughout the week. Does this keep in or out the meek? Let's not forget the chapel clock. It goes quite well. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It even strikes each half and hour when it is given motive power. This noble pile, Church of the Free, gave shelter to the ARP. When dogs of war beset our land, 'twas here we locals made our stand. When siren called and searchlights beamed, when all was lost, or so it seemed. The phone was manned, and first aid staff brewed tea, rolled bandages, tried to laugh. The Sunday school, in days of yore, was full each Sabbath to the door. Now what ails this forlorn place? Have we begot a godless race? So let's move on to livelier places, perchance to meet familiar faces. The village green, a tarmac jungle, another parish council bungle. The old post office, filling station. Buy your stamps, get animation. The phone exchange was right next door, with tennis courts, some 3 or 4, a bowling green where village lads played old man's marbles with their dads. So where are the landmarks that still endure? Got to try Station Street next, for sure. There's the memorial, built of granite, for those killed in battle, names carved upon it, and there is the frame for the honour roll. But dear Lord preserve us, where is the scroll? Rosemary Road lies just over there, where once was a cinema, lonely and rare. And there's Old Horse Road, now metalled and new, once flanked by green hedgerows and lovers too. Here is the park, or ground recreation, given by miners for our population, and kept in condition so neat and so trim, but looked at it now, decrepit and grim. When God built our village, he was left with one plot. So he hastily dropped it and said, that's the lot. But look at it now with its airs and its graces. It's called Park Street, by golly, with lots of new faces. We once had a fire engine, all shiny and bright, which lived in the fire station down on the right. And what do we find in this wonderful spot? A paint shop for cars that are going to pot. Now, when a fire strikes us day or night, we find ourselves in an awful plight. Got to phone Cannock or some other town. Our lot can't afford to run one of their own. Down here on the left was Tuppenny Row. Some very old cottages, small and low. And down at the bottom is the railway station, from where, if you're rich, you could visit the nation. 2 platforms, some gas lamps, in a room you could dally, then catch your connection to Rugeley Trent Valley. So where has it gone? All this passenger power? Who is wielding the axe in yon ivory tower? So let's always make sure, with our British phlegm, that when we pass by, we'll remember them.
And now that we're in the 21st century, let's have another walk round the Bonk to see how much Cheslyn has changed over the last 150 years. We'll start with a reference from White's History and Gazetteer of 1851.
Cheslyn Hay includes 3 farms, 2 collieries and the large but irregularly built village of Worley Bank, which is about 2 miles south of Cannock. The Lodge Farm, which comprises a large portion of this liberty, belongs to J. N. Lane, Esquire, and the rest belongs to C.P. Ing, Esquire, Mr. Chambly, and a few smaller owners. Upon the lodge farm, an eminence planted with firs may be seen at a considerable distance. The village of Worley Bank contains a few good houses and a great number of cottages. It has been much improved during the last 20 years and has now more than 800 inhabitants. Before the common was enclosed, this place, on account of its extra-parochial exemption from civil authority, became the great resort of beggars and lawless vagabonds, many of whom raised mud cottages on the heath and enclosed small plots of garden ground, which, after an unmolested enjoyment of several years, they claimed as their freehold property. It then became a nursery for illegitimate children, but the opening of the neighbouring coal mines, however, brought some respectable inhabitants to the place, who established a plan for relieving the poor and erected a Methodist chapel and Sunday school.
Not what you'd call a totally welcoming picture. So to lead us into our walk, let's have a few words from Jeff Blunt, the chairman and founder member of the Cheslyn Local History Society.
Welcome to Cheslyn Hay, once known as Worley Bank, or to the locals just simply the Bonk. Once consisting of large areas of wasteland and common land, this attracted many squatters to the area who set up small businesses making pegs, besoms and selling heather. Incoming miners set up basic education along with the first chapel circa 1789 near the site of the present Salem, which dates to 1898. That very first chapel was a barn with a thatched roof belonging to a man named Gasser. Many fine chapel choirs arose from those humble beginnings, and madrigal societies and operatic groups flourished under the patronage of the Hawkins family and others. It is said that from the top of the Bonk down to the bottom one could count 13 pubs and beer houses, and with this in mind we start our walk here on the site of the old Red Lion, overlooking the Old Falls area.
It's thought that there was a building on this site since the 17th century, and here you'll see some of the old licensees. The seed houses, with the first group of locals to receive their old age pensions. Thomas Perks with the clay pipe smoking club. And later on, James Blurton in the 30s. And these are a few of the late regulars before they closed. Directly over the road where the library now stands was the Red Lion Bowling Green, with Dr. Sawyery, seen here with the Folleses, Bakers, Locketts and the Davises. The Collier's Arms was also in existence 160 years ago. And this sketch appeared in the Express and Star in the 50s. Behind the library, where Mighty Road is today, used to be the centre of many of the village's activities and was known as the Barn Flat. This used to be the base of travelling fairs and circuses and where the early carnivals and Worley Bonk wakes were held. Many sporting tussles have been battled out here, and even in the early 60s, the Pinfold Lane School still had its annual sports days on the fields right here. Leading away up to the top of the village, there's always been shops. The pet shop used to be Assels, a general hardware store that opened from dawn to dusk, and whose services included everything from repairing bikes to recharging accumulators for wirelesses. Alongside the shop is the Slings Path, or Peg Alley, that led across the fields to Dundalk Lane. And this is where one of the earliest bands in Cheslyn practised in a cabin, and it became known as the Slings Band. Joseph Kingston developed his talent for music with this band way back in the 1870s, and he became one of the finest cornet players in the district, later becoming bandmaster to the Cheslyn Star Band and then the Victoria Band. In the 1930s, this became the Cheslyn Brass Band and then the Prize Band. But by the outbreak of war, the trend was to the more popular music of the times. And in 1938, Horace Stokes from the Town Well formed the Carlton Band, as aired on this very early 78 record. This was followed later by the Altona Dance Band, and they were in great demand until the general demise of all bands in the 50s, when Horace reverted to the Horace Stokes Trio. Over the road was Garbutt's the bakery and Pratt's the cobblers. Pinfold House was built on the site of a row of very old cottages. And in amongst these cottages was the Nelson, where the well-respected Dr. Hugh Anton Sawyery tragically ended his life here one January night in 1925. He'd settled in Cheslyn from the Far East, living in Atherton Street, and after a full and active life, he inexplicably downed a phial of poison whilst drinking with his friends. Here at the corner of Pinfold Lane was the Atherton Arms. That become quite a popular cafe in between the wars. Close to some very old cottages where the path was raised 3 foot above the road, with steps leading up to an entry. On the other side of the road was the Beehive shop. That also saw plenty of activity in the early 1900s. It served as a tommy shop, where tokens paid out by the Hawkins pit as part of the men's wages could be exchanged for grocery and goods. The National Schoolhouse still stands in Pinfold Lane, but the school itself closed in 1879 to be replaced by the Cheslyn Board School, fronting Hatherton Street, which was in 1882 with Charles Richard Walton, the first headmaster, in charge of 146 children of all ages. Here's a photograph of part of the first intake, with all the names still available. By the 1890s, the school had to be enlarged and more teachers set on to cater for the 600 pupils. Miss Scragg became responsible for the infants, but she was followed by the ever-popular Mary Ewan Allen, whose lifetime of teaching was commemorated by 13 trees being planted around the playground. Each tree represented an initial of her name, starting with a May tree, an ash, a rowan and a yew tree. But all that remains now is the ash tree on the corner of Pinfold Lane and Hill Street, close to where the caretaker's house still stands. Round the corner, there's still a part of the original school wall to be seen. Mr. Ernie Carter was headmaster for 22 years until 1944, and his influence had a long-lasting effect on the village. He was keen on all sports. He introduced day trips to the seaside, and to celebrate the school's Jubilee year, he formed a boys' club, converting the old national school into a centre for a full range of activities, with billiards, table tennis, a basic gymnasium, football, cricket, and even cards and reading. When Mr. Carter retired, he was followed by Mr. Herbert Perks, and then Mr. George Cadman in the 50s. But the last headmaster of the school was Jack Martin, an ex-professional footballer who played for Aston Villa in the 30s and 40s, seen here with the school's 1954 football team. He remained there until the Cheslyn High School finally closed its doors in 1985. Here are a few lines penned by the children on the closing of the school.
Farewell to the school. Slowly but gratefully walk out the door. No one's come to this school anymore. For one last time the bell will ring. Goodbye, goodbye to everything. To every picture on the wall, to arching windows very tall, to the assemblies where we sing. Goodbye, goodbye to everything. To school and playground, teachers all, to fields and trees that grow so tall. Great happiness this school did bring. Goodbye, goodbye to everything. Our memories will last forevermore. Those patterns on the concrete floor, the pens, the pencils, the glue, the string. Goodbye, goodbye to everything. The final bell rings, the last slam of the door. Cheslyn High School, alas, is no more. And as it all ends, still we shall sing goodbye and thanks for everything.
Further down the street from the school, on the corner, was the Co-op stores. And in Wolverhampton Road, this bungalow was the automated telephone exchange during the war. The only public allotments in the village now are here off the Wolverhampton Road, and have recently celebrated their centenary. Also commemorated by a few words from our local poet and humorist, Viv Bruton.
Every year up in Fold Lane, the allotment men they pray for rain. There's Mr. Bladen with his whistle digging up the weed and thistle. Then amongst the cauliflowers you'll find old Tommy Powers. All day long they'll dig and tat with Tommy in his pork pie hat. But then the judges come to test to see whose taters are the best. Dickie Horton tuts and sighs as Whistler Bladen wins first prize. He says he'll get his act together and blames his failure on the weather. But then old Bladen with his barrow comes passing by with a massive marrow and says, "Here, with this arm really chuffed, I'm just off now to get it stuffed."
Next to the allotments is the cemetery, and it was in 1900 that the council decided to have its own graveyard, and the first interment was Mary Ann Ridgway on the 27th of December. This iron chapel was built for the princely sum of £131 4 and twopence, but the turret had to be replaced in the following year by Lewis Tillery's for an extra 30 bob. Unfortunately, the chapel fell out of use and it was destroyed by fire in 1988. There's several military graves here, including this unmarked grave of First World War hero Sergeant Bob Andy of the South Staffs. He was awarded both the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the Croix de Guerre, France's highest award for heroism, for conspicuous bravery at Arras, and his medals are proudly displayed by his niece Kath Dawson. The old waterworks were sited off Warstones Road. For centuries, Cheslyn had depended upon water either drawn from pumps and wells or even carried by bucket from the local pools, which led to many illnesses and premature deaths. And thanks to the efforts of Dr. Hosegood, this pumping station was built in 1903, so that everyone could enjoy the benefits of clean drinking water. Around the same time, the isolation hospital was opened. It was a small building with only a dozen beds to accommodate patients with diseases such as diphtheria and scarlet fever. William Altree was the first caretaker, and Dr. Malone and his wife were the medical officers. It was closed in 1948 and reopened several years later as the William Baxter School for Slow Learners under this management committee. Heading back to the village, all this land was once Cheslyn Common. And this was Ivy House Farm, run by Mr. Cluley, where Evelyn Hitchins, as a young girl at Grove Cottage next door, still remembers churning the cream into butter. During the war, the Hitchins would entertain wounded soldiers from the Royal Hospital in Wolverhampton. At the end of Wolverhampton Road, you can see the corner that separates High Street and Low Street, known locally as L's Corner, taken from the name of Helston's Cottages. These kids were known as the Marlow Kids, living close to the Marlow, now Denfield Drive. Bearing left into Sardin Road was where the old company buildings stood, a row of terraced houses built by Hawkins Colliery to accommodate their miners. This was also the home of another World War I hero, Tom Lockett, a recipient of both the DCM and Military Medal in 1917. Further down is another old farmhouse that was once an alehouse, the Wagon and Horses. But when Richard Emersley took over the tenancy in 1836, the licence was lapsed. 4 generations of the Emersley family have remained in this house for 140 years, until 1980, when Richard's great-grandson Bert vacated the premises. In 1960, the land was sold off to the education authorities for the Cheslyn High School to be built. Opposite the school, down this unobtrusive path, still stands the remains of the old sewage works that operated for over 50 years until the 70s. But how few of the locals were ever aware of its existence. It was opened in 1923 in a grand manner, with a dozen bottles of champagne ordered from the woodman to celebrate. But due to human error, only 11 bottles were delivered, and one still remains untouched to this day. And now, heading towards Wedges Mills, we come to the real history of Cheslyn High.
We're now standing on the top of Lodge Hill. The fields over in the distance there were once part of Cheslyn Common and were enclosed under the Act of 1792. Also in the distance there were 2 small pools that were known as the Bacon Pits. The word bacon being a corruption of beacon, which goes back to the Anglo-Saxon days when it was in line with various other beacons, and the beacons would be lit to signify the arrival of marauding tribes. The name Cheslyn also dates back to this period of Anglo-Saxon history and is said to mean the burial place of a chest or coffin. The word hay denoted an area within the confines of the ancient forest of Cannock. When in 1834 the name of Worley Bank was dropped, the ancient name Cheslyn Hay was adopted.
So somewhere around here an ancient burial site could still exist. Further down from Middle Hill lies Lodge Farm, that was built over 200 years ago and owned by some notable families, such as the Lanes, the Quintons and the Hawkins. And the footpath by the side of the Winking Frog is all that remains of what is thought to be the original coach road leading to Lodge Farm. And every Whit Tuesday, it was a local tradition of the Salem Church to have a parade from the village to picnic on the Knob at Middle Hill. The Walk Mill area was where the local industries were situated, together with several stretches of water, including Haunchwood Pool. It used to be the clay pit for Lewis's Tilleries before its closure, and is now a popular venue for fishermen. As mining flourished, so did the need to develop the canal system, and the Staffs and Worcester Canal was built in the 1770s, and coal was transported through the coal basins. Hawkins Pit, or to give it its proper title, the Cannock Old Coppice Colliery, was an important site amongst the colliery fields of the Chase and dates back to the early 19th century, before Joseph Hawkins acquired it. It was to become the major source of employment in the area, and in its heyday there were over 700 miners working here, but it eventually closed in August 1960. Nearby were the Rosemary Tilleries, another important source of work for the locals. It was big enough to be supplied by a network of tramways, and its chimney stacks dominated the skyline. Cannock Fertilisers was another name that was famous throughout the world, and its factory can be seen here in the background, where the Warp Mill Industrial Estate is today, alongside the Staffs and Worcester Canal. Known as the Monkey Muck, its putrefying smell would linger for days in damp weather, but everybody just got used to it. Over the road lies the Atherton Reservoir, or as it is known to all and sundry, the Razza, which was the balancing reservoir for the canal system. The area off Coppice Lane used to be a blaze of gorse bushes, but after Hawkins Colliery had flattened their coal mound in the 1920s, they developed its own sports ground. And he's Jim Brevitt, who has researched all the sporting aspects.
The square on which I'm standing has been played on for 80 years by Hawkins' cricket club, and the original Cheslyn cricket club played on a pitch at Bounds Lane, near to where the Mary Rose is now, and that was 20 years earlier. So it makes cricket on the village 100 years old. This Cheslyn cricket team of 1905 was very much based on local dignitaries. Arnold Hawkins as captain, Dr. Cyree vice captain, Charles Walton umpire, and Henry Hawkins as the club president. As cricket developed, the club had to rely more and more on youth and the manual workers, as can be seen with this 1924 side. Dr. Cyree once rewarded the young fast bowler Fred Altree with a guinea for taking all 10 wickets in an innings. Joseph Hawkins established this ground for his workers' use. Hawkins Sport began producing strong cricketing sides. The original site of the pavilion over there became the Hawkins Sports and Social Club, in which was held dances, weddings and other receptions, and it was a pivotal point of the community.
In Coppice Lane, number 49, was where Joseph Kingston, the renowned cornet player and bandmaster, used to live. And when he died at the age of 80 in 1936, he was survived by his wife Mary and their 13 children. Many of the descendants are still living locally today. At the corner of Coppice Lane and Littlewood Road stood Benton's Farm. It was on this land, and thanks to the endeavours of the headmaster Ernie Carter, a site was earmarked for a youth centre. The Duke of Gloucester arrived to cut the first sod on the 30th of September 1939. But unfortunately, the impending hostilities with Germany put a halt to all the plans, and Mr. Carter's lifetime's ambitions were never realised. Down Littlewood Road, there stands a pair of charming cottages dating back to around 1750, together with a Tetnal Dick's pear tree, also confirmed to be over 200 years old. The first mention of the Woodman Inn was in 1862. It became the home for 3 generations of the Rogers family. Emma was a dominant lady, and when her husband Jim died in 1891 at the age of 36, she carried on running the pub very successfully until the son, also named Jim, became 21 and he took over the reins. He retired in 1950 so that his son, another Jim, would become the 3rd generation of Rogerses as landlords, and the tradition continued for another 10 years. The Woodman was always a popular drinking place, but their pride and joy was its bowling green.
In 1923, the bowling green was laid here behind the Woodman, and it was the start of a golden era of bowls in the area, with many a local player representing the county. There were 7 bowling greens in Cheslyn Hay: the Working Men's Club, the Dog, the Collier's Arms, the Red Lion, Hawkins's Colliery Sports Club, New Inns, and here at the Woodman. This unique piece of film shows an actual bowling match here on the Woodman Bowling Green over 40 years ago.
Littlewood Lane has changed considerably over the last few decades. This is looking up towards Station Street before the flats were built. And at the bottom end, here's where Shorter's bike shop was, and where the Gaskins, Plants and Dicey's lived. One of the local characters was Oscar Dunn, who had allotments here, and would often be seen collecting the watercress from the brook. There used to be a mineral tramway dating back to the 1700s that passed through here to Gilpin's Tool Works. But the need for improving transport became vital, and the Great Wherley and Churchbridge Railway Station was opened in 1858. changing its name to Worley and Cheslyn High Station in 1896. St Mark's was erected a few years before the railway station in 1845, when it became the parish church of Cheslyn High and Great Worley, with the very first interment being the infant Mary Ann Hemmensley, the firstborn of Richard of Sorden Road Farm, and her grave remains untouched today. Heading up Station Street, you'll realise how little things have changed over the last century. Walter Harvey, the coal merchants at number 164. And note how Cheslyn High has been deleted for security reasons during the war. And the new inns is still here, having been built in 1825. Here's licensee Joe Sims. And he's three locals, Aaron Richards, Charlie Brough and Mr. Love. This unobtrusive garage also has some history to it. It used to be the old fire station and housed the village's only fire engine. It was another example of the generosity of Thomas Hawkins, who donated the money for the station to be erected in 1908. Replacing its previous site at the top of Landywood Lane, where the horse used to be kept. Thomas Hawkins named the fire engine Aletha, after his daughter. Running alongside the fire station is the pathway to the Worley Cemetery, opened in 1897, and although it was sited within the Great Worley parish, the access was in Cheslyn High. That is why the gates were set back to highlight the parish boundary. But for the past 15 years, the cemetery has been acknowledged as being in Cheslyn High, with the railway line itself now the boundary line. On the corner of Coppice Lane was Garrett's shop, later Elwell's, and then Mears's. And opposite, I wonder how many brides has Mr. North escorted to St Mark's in his taxi. The impressive Dorset House has overlooked Station Street throughout the last century, and it has housed many of the village's doctors. Dr. Osgood from Dorset had the house built and moved into it in the 1920s. He was followed by Dr. Reggie Tompkinson, who married Agnes Sutherland from Falkirk, and they used Dorset House as their surgery throughout the war. The Sunday school, or Lot School, was Worley Bonk's first school and was founded in 1824 as a Sunday school by the British School Authority. It was let as a day school, and a young Miss Sue Perks remembered having to pay a penny a week together to attend there in the 1880s. After it ceased to be a school, the building has had many uses, including the local undertaker, Mr. Hudson, who made his coffins there. In Park Street, or the Lot, Tony Reid was born, in one of the old cottages no longer standing. Not only has Tony become a world-acclaimed writer of non-fiction books, winning the Wingate Literary Prize in 1989, but he has been an outstandingly successful TV writer and producer, writing Doctor Who, The Baker Street Boys, episodes of Z-Cars, and more recently Heartbeat. He was also responsible for series such as Sherlock Holmes, The Troubleshooters and The Lotus Eaters. He don't live in the lot anymore. He lives next door to Terry Wogan. Not bad for a local lad. Someone who was born in Park Street and lived all her life in the lot area is Kath Wormsley.
On the corner there was the grocery shop belonging to Mr. Albert Hawkins. Next here there were 3 small cottages, and when I was a little girl was a sweet shop by the name of Mr. and Mrs. Lockett. Number 8 lived Mr. and Mrs. Evans some years ago, and when war broke out, the men in the street, some of them, came and put supports in the cellar and planks, and when the air raids used to come, this is where we used to go and shelter. Also, many years before that, the Perry family lived here, and Mr. Perry did drown himself in the cellar. This was 2 cottages, and the tiny one there were 11 people in there, 9 children with a mother and father. Next door were the Perrys, and the 8 in that family. Next door was the Bruffs, and that was 8 in that family. And the next cottage where the Cadmans lived, and there were 6 in that cottage. Where the 3 green trees are there, that's where the cottage was, where my grandfather lived. My father was born there, and my brother and I were born there. This is the house where Bob Andy lived, who was our local hero in the First World War. On the wall here and into the entry, all the boys used to put their names on there. There's Perks, Bills, Perry, Wesley, Hart, and most of the boys off the village that used to play in the street. Some date back to 1923. These houses were built by Emma Rogers in 1901, and she had her initials put on the property. When her daughter married Mr. Perks, he crossed a bit off the R and made it into a P.
This is the recreational ground, which was donated by the miners' welfare in the early part of the century and has been used by the children of Cheslyn ever since. The field on which I'm standing now, the football area, was donated to the miners of Cheslyn by Joseph Hawkins. And in 1944, when I played on it first, it was grey pitch shale, just interspersed with a few clumps of grass. Now it's almost like a First Division pitch. There were quite a few teams that played on quite a few pitches around here from the last century, including Cheslyn Social, Cheslyn FC, Cheslyn Rovers, the adult evening classes, the boys clubs, the Salem Youth Club and the pub teams. This strong British Legion side of 1952 got into 6 finals and they lost every single one of them. But it was these clubs that produced our 2 notable professional footballers, Mac Potts and Charlie Moore. Mac Potts of Pinfold Lane played for Manchester United, but in 1920 he was transferred to the Wolves for £100 and he appeared for them in the FA Cup final against Tottenham. He carried on playing local football until he was well into his 40s, ending up with the Red, White and Blue pub at Featherstone. The other one who also made his name with United was Charlie Moore. He was born and lived at 131 Station Street before moving up to Manchester in 1919, where he played as fullback for over 12 years, making 328 appearances. When he retired, he kept a pub in Manchester before returning home to spend his last years of his life with his sister in Windsor Road.
This was also where the carnivals used to be held after the war. Carnival was one of the highlights of the year, with endless hours spent on the floats, as seen here in the carnivals of the early 60s. The Gingham Girls were a dancing troupe formed by Cliff Hooper and named because of the material used by Etty Dunn, who made all the costumes for them. And here they are making their debut in the Carnival of 1962 with their leader Pamela Cheshire. Travelling extensively throughout the area, they appeared in many fetes and charitable functions, and they continued until 1981 with much success, having discovered a champion leader in Karen Thomas, who won a national competition called the Battle of Britain Prize 2 years running as the best leader. Another troupe was formed called the Chantels, and because of the interest, a much younger group named the Honeytots also took to competing. A decontamination centre was built on the wreck during the war, and afterwards this provided a community centre for whist drives, wedding receptions and dancing classes with Cliff Hooper before the centre fell into disuse. The Cheslyn Working Men's Club was another important cornerstone in village life, since its opening shown here in 1903. It provided social entertainment, sporting activities, garden parties and many coach trips to the seaside from way back to the 20s. Here on one of those trips to Blackpool is Sam Hall, who lived to the ripe old age of 104. The club was of a size to incorporate all the local associations to use as their headquarters. There was the British Legion with Dr. McCange, the president, the Buffs, the Home Guard and the AFS. Plus, of course, the traditional Bull Terrier Club, Whippet Racing and Pigeon Flying. At the heart of all working men's clubs were the committee men, and there seem to have been some pretty impressive committees residing there over the years. This sketch dates back to the late 1940s, when the Dawsons were the stewards and Fred Pearson the secretary and Sim Parbrook the treasurer. The club was also the base for choirs, holding their practice nights there, and the Cheslyn Male Voice Choir was formed in 1919. In the early years, the conductors were Ernie Amphlett, followed by John Howard Shingler, before Howard Benton took over the baton, and strangely enough, all three of them died whilst actively conducting their choirs. The standards were high, and the choir took first prizes in more than 40 Eisteddfords and open competitions throughout the country. They then formed the basis of the now well-acclaimed Chase Orpheus Choir, and here you can hear them singing the Bonk anthem, a specially adapted piece of music by Cornelius Whitehouse for this area.
The Rose and Crown was not far from the White Lion seen here.
But nothing remains now but memories. Jack Pratt, who was a popular professional sprinter and left-winger for Walsall, took over the pub on 3 separate occasions to boost trade, but eventually it was forced to close and it was turned into living accommodation. The recently developed New Horse Road replaced the old Oss Road, and this was the route to the 10-score pools and to the Great Whaley Colliery or Plant Pit, where the first of the Whaley gang's maimings occurred. It was on this land near the wreck the horses would graze after working long hours underground at the pit. The connection with horses is still maintained with the White Oss Public House, opened in 1968. And Hackett's small holding still survives, although the scene is much less rural today. Where we are now is Mount Pleasant, and who can remember Thacker's shop and his tat yard opposite? He sold old war surplus goods such as radios and uniforms, but he was renowned for his ex-army bikes, known locally as the Thacker Trackers or Thunderbolts, all for the price of 30 bob. His yard was the coal yard, and Wharf Cottage was the offices for the wharf, and just behind these houses was Sunshine Farm, originally a pig and poultry farm before becoming a large nursery that thrived in the 30s. Chapel Square, so called because this was the site of an early primitive Methodist chapel, and it has always been a busy meeting point of the village. There was the White Lion, seen here with the Old Boys Club, with Teddy Turner as landlord, and 3 more of the Follows family. Rosemary Road used to be called the Tramway or the Railroad, after the narrow gauge railway, which carried coal from local pits near Fisher's Farm, past the Tilleries and the Lesers Pools, to the Walkmill Basins. Where Bart's garage used to stand was St George's Hall, otherwise known as Britannia Hall. It's been the headquarters and drill hall for the Home Guard and the Salvation Army. It was also the village hall, dance hall, meeting room for the miners, and even used as a chapel of ease. Next door on this site was the cinema, one of the first in the area. A 16-year-old Agnes Perk saw her first magic lantern show here in 1899, and it was known as the Picture Palace, changing its name to the Palladium in 1920. In the early days, the proprietor was Mr. Thacker, but later a well-known Dutch opera singer, Heinrich Johannes van Lachtrop, and his Danish wife were in charge. In 1930, it was lavishly redecorated for the advent of the talkies, and the management proudly announced that in the interest of its patrons, the cinema would be disinfected with oil before and during every performance. Unfortunately, the cinema proved too small to compete with its competitors in Cannock, and its last performance was in 1932. Years ago, a Talbot was a popular hunting dog, and the locals always referred to the Talbot pub as the Dog. When it was rebuilt in 1972, it reverted back to its old name again. In front of the pub was the original village green, used for the earliest carnivals, and where the village stocks were used for drunkards and wife beaters. Low Street used to be called Red Lane because of the colour of the clay. It has always contained many old cottages full of character, and also many local personalities full of character. The cedar tree used to be the old post office. This was run by several generations of the Wootton family, the original owner being William Wootton, who took over the responsibilities of postmaster way back in the 1830s. In more recent times, both George Wootton and Fred Wootton kept the post office. A smaller shop was added to the existing premises in 1903, but you can still see the remains of the original Sunlight soap advert on the side of the old post office.
Where the incorrectly spelt Grasmere Court is today
was a red ash tennis court, and opposite stood the largest and one of the most prestigious mansions in the village, Grasmere. Built by Arnold Hawkins, this was his residence for most of his life. Arnold was an accomplished organist, and it was his influence, together with the support of the Hawkins family, that Cheslyn was to develop musical interests, organising concert parties, and then forming the Madrigal Society. Local talent was also nurtured, and Ryden Hickman, who lived in Station Street, was one of the principal baritones of the Berlin State Opera before the war, and Roy Henderson appeared at Glyndebourne. First-class productions of Faust and Carmen were produced at the Salem Church, and Arnold Hawkins secured the services of such nationally acclaimed artists as Hedel Nash, Heather Harper, Jennifer Vivian, Robert Easton, Constance Shacklock, Isabel Bailey, and Kathleen Ferrier. Further down Low Street was Hawkins' shop at number 67, and in Coronation Row, Allsop's sweet shop also did brisk business between the wars. And down this path was the Old Falls area. It was named Old Falls after the drastic felling of all the old trees and mixed woodlands in the 1600s. This was a very active site for the mining of clay in the 60s, stretching from here to Walkmill. Queen Street has had many colourful characters over the years, but for the non-bonkers, we'll call it the alley. But the alley has changed completely, and not one of the old houses remain. Turning down into High Street, this television shop and the knick-knack shop were built by the Alltree brothers for living accommodation for Will and Charles, with Sam using the frontage as a butcher's shop. But unfortunately, Will's wife Emma died within a week of moving in. Mrs. Hanley run a private library from where Paradines is today. The Chinese takeaway was Hilda Rickens' fish and chip shop, and Wood's has always been a grocery store, with William Perks owning it 100 years ago. One can only imagine how the grocers looked after their customers in those days, if this marvellous 1909 calendar is anything to go by. In Cross Street there was Paradine selling homegrown garden produce, and Albert Bullivant the barber's, and of course the town well and water pump, which still stands today. The butcher's shop was built by Thomas Hart, who was the bailiff at Lodge Farm, where they were well known for holding meat fairs there every year. The Harts were the bailiffs, and the same family have served the local community as butchers for 3 generations. Here in Park House was the home of another of the Hawkins family, Mr. Leslie Hawkins, before Dr. McCainch took up residence there, holding his surgeries in a specially converted cellar. This cottage here, once the home of the Paradines, is another fine example of an 18th century building still in existence. And the Zion Chapel stood in Cross Street for over 70 years. It was erected by the Primitive Methodists in 1880, after moving from their original place of worship in Chapel Square, but was forced to be closed in 1958 when the roof was about to collapse. During its time, it had a regular and enthusiastic congregation, leaving many people with many happy memories. At the top of Cross Street, on the High Street, was Crutchley's shop. And notice how the level of the stone steps and the cellar windows have now disappeared, as the pavements have been built up over the years. The entry next to the shop was called Crutchley's Entry, leading now into Colliery Close, later to be known as Bobby's Entry, because the local policeman lived nearby in the terrace of miners' houses owned by Hawkins Colliery. Crutchley's grocery shop changed hands, and it was run by the 2 Miss Thomases, Gertie and Ginny, only for the business to be bought by their manager, the popular Joe Pickin. Then there was Faraday's, the chemist's, with its dentistry next door. This was took over by Arthur Stevenson in 1953, and his son Roger still runs the pharmacy, but now at the bottom of High Street. Wimby Westwood was the English and foreign fruiterers, now the home of Frida Wally. Frida was awarded an MBE for her community work, and this view here looking up towards the colliers gives you a feel of the tranquil days of yesteryear, where all the traffic to be seen is an Austin 10 and a Thacker's Thunderbolt. Then we have Glenthorne House, the home of Thomas Hawkins, with magnificent gardens looking down towards the plant pit. Nearby Poplar Farm is thought to date back to the 1790s, and around the corner in Dundalk Lane, or Dundalk as it used to be known, were many cottages built to house the farm labourers. Deeds date back to 1793, but it is thought that these cottages were in existence another 100 years before this. Unfortunately, only these remain. Just yards away lies the remains of the Worley and Essington Canal, known as the Curly Worley, and it helped to supply the Black Country with coal, while the Nook Pit, run by the Worley Colliery Company, was sunk in 1874 to provide work for as many as 260 miners. It was finally closed in 1949. Up Landywood Lane and on the corner of High Street stood Hawkins Yard. Turning into the High Street, we come to the Salem Chapel. This present edifice dates from 1855, but extended to provide this magnificent frontage in 1898. It soon became the cultural centre of the village. A library was established, and the Sunday school was also built, which in later years housed the youth club. It also provided the base for the Scouts and the Boys Brigade. Salem, however, were involved with many fine choirs over the years, and during the war its choir entertained troops and became involved in charity work. After the war, it continued to raise large sums of money for the Bombed Churches Fund, making several broadcasts on the radio. Salem have always been involved with many activities throughout the year, celebrating Empire Day, organising ladies' outings. Written on this photograph is visiting the tea rooms at Matlock. And the ladies group also were involved with many musical events, as well as their regular choirs. The Ivy House at 1 High Street was where Joseph Hawkins lived, and together with his wife Mary raised a family of 13 children. This remarkable early photograph shows the Hawkins family in 1852. Joseph, the head of the family, is said to be the founder of the village, having been born here in 1812 and creating many jobs at his pit. And son Henry on the far left founded the brickworks and tilleries. The name Hawkins was destined to be kept at the forefront of village life for generations, and this posed photograph of 1901 portrays 4 of the Hawkins generations, with Joseph seen holding his great-grandson's hand.
Number 3 became the police station of the village,
with Sergeant Edward Balance taking up residence there with his family in 1929. He was in charge of the section covering the area from the Fleur-de-Lis to Gailey, to Featherstone and to Newtown, all with the support of 6 constables. The local bobbies were Atwood and Lake. 5 High Street was also built in 1845, was the home of Walter and Marina Hackett, who also had 13 children. They become a familiar name in the village, running a butcher's shop and supplying bowls of mouth-watering faggots and pays.
It's appropriate we finish our walk here at the War Memorial, remembering all those of 2 wars who made the supreme sacrifice on our behalf.
The 2 world wars devastated many families, none more so than the Farnell family, where Richard, George and Samson all lost their lives in the First World War. One little known recorded fact is that there were more men enlisted from Cheslyn Hay per head of population for World War I than in any other village, town or city in the country. And we can be proud of the fact that apart from the honours bestowed on Bob Andy, Clarence Hawkins received the Military Cross, and Tom Lockett, Les Belcher, George Allen and Joe Shorter were all awarded military medals in the wars. And let us not forget the 72 names on the cenotaph of the men who never returned home. As we reflect upon the last century, we should look forward with hope and confidence for the next generations. Better schools, better facilities and better housing. But let us finish with a nostalgic note, with a few more words penned by our own poet, Viv Bruton.
The county planners met one day to rearrange old Cheslyn A. So many improvements they had to list them, and they started with a one-way system. That didn't seem so very cruel, so next came down the primary school. Out came the edges and the ditches to put more bungalows on football pitches. Although the villagers did complain, they still destroyed old Dundalk Lane. They said their aim was just to please, by ripping up more shrubs and trees. And instead of where the blackbird sings, there now stands houses fit for kings. I often say, and I'm so glad, that I remember the times I've had. But looking back, I can only say how much I love old Cheslyn A.